Well, welcome to the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers Spotlight on the Issues webinar series. I'm your host, Jason Modulin, the president of the Alliance. It's my honor to be with you today. The Texas Alliance of Energy Producers represents over 2,600 individuals and member companies that are focused on advancing independent operators and the standards of the Texas oil and gas industry. Through advocacy for smart energy and environmental policy, effective communications, and cost-saving programs, the Alliance has delivered for our members for over 90 years. Founded in 1930 in Wichita Falls as the North Texas Oil and Gas Association, we merged with the West Central Texas Oil and Gas Association from Abilene in 2000 and expanded our focus statewide, adding members from across the state. While we celebrate our past, we are firmly focused on the future, delivering solutions for Texas independent operators. A special thanks to our President's Forum sponsors, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Marathon Oil for making these events possible. I would now like to call on our board chairman, Psy Wagner, to help get us started. She is a dynamic leader, a second-generation oil producer, an Aggie petroleum engineer who is at the helm of her family's 40-year oil and gas business in Fort Worth. Psy, would you like to make a few remarks?
Sure. Thanks, Jason. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. Lee, a special thanks to you. For our members that are not familiar with our partnership with IPAA, it goes back many years. Lee worked with us on our white paper and hosted us in DC for numerous events. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Lee many times at IPAA's annual conventions, and he is a real asset to the Alliance, and I'm glad you're all tuning in today to hear the update that he's going to provide. Thank you to our members for joining in and for our board. And as always, Jason and staff, great job in getting these virtual events put together. And we hope to see you all again very soon.
Well, thank you, Psy, very much for your leadership. And on that produced water white paper, we were just handing that out yesterday to the Senate Water Committee. So it's come in handy and certainly a great resource for the Alliance and IPAA and lawmakers right now during session. So our guest today is Lee Fuller, Executive Vice President of the Independent Petroleum Association of America. Lee joined the IPAA staff in 1998 and is responsible for coordination of legislative and regulatory activities. He has 35 years of experience in federal policy issues. He served as staff on U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works from 1978 through 1986. In those last 2 years, he was the minority staff director serving under Senator Lloyd Bentsen. Before coming to Washington, Fuller worked for Exxon Company at its Baytown, Texas refinery, providing technical support for process operations and managing environmental compliance issues. He graduated from Lehigh University as a chemical engineer. I wanted to remind you, if you would like to submit a question to Lee, please utilize the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We will go till about 10:40 this morning and wrap up with a few audience questions. Lee, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Jason. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you so much for participating in our Spotlight on the Issues series. You were very gracious to join us back in September with Ann Austin, EPA's Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at the time. She's now in private practice in Washington, D.C., and a lot has changed over the past 6 months. The title of our webinar, it certainly seems like the most hostile legislative and regulatory environment ever in Washington, D.C. for the oil and gas industry, maybe even eclipsing the Obama years. That, coupled with the effective majority in both chambers, would appear to make this a pretty perilous time for upstream oil and gas here in the United States. Is that a fair characterization from your standpoint?
Jason, I think it is a fair characterization, even perhaps more than that. I think this is a framework that's never really existed before. I mean, from the industry's perspective, it's been weakened by an economic crisis that limits its ability to really contest a lot of the issues just financially. At the same time, industry is under considerable social pressure to redefine its existence based on external pressures that are frequently defined by anti-fossil energy advocates. The federal government, as you stated, is controlled by a party that's at this point committed to eliminating American oil and natural gas. The policy decisions that we're seeing driven in many cases are done by analyses that I don't think any credible energy economist would create. And at the same time, many of those policy options are focusing on limiting American supply rather than altering American demand. And that doesn't really change the outcome. It just eliminates a source and forces us back to the potential of being dependent upon foreign oil, which we learned for 50 years is not the best circumstance to be in as an American nation. So as we look across the board, we've got two different arenas that are going to be active. One is regulations by the administration, and the other is going to be legislation by the Congress. So let me just kind of walk through some of those on a very broad level, and then we can get into more details as we get into Q&A. In the regulatory arena, one thing we've noticed from both the Obama and the Trump administrations is they can demonstrate that the executive branch can act through its regulatory process to aggressively create significant policy changes, limited only by judicial constraints, that Congress can't really stop them if Congress is an ineffective legislative body. So those lessons that have been learned are going to be applied and going to be applied much more aggressively by the Biden administration. We've already seen the first steps of that with the Department of Interior, with the actions to temporarily ban new leasing in onshore and offshore federal lands. How that plays out over the next several months is going to be really significant. We're also seeing pressures to see changes that would turn around regulations that were done during the Trump administration, increase royalty rates, change rental payments, review the whole resource management planning process, and limiting leasing in the Gulf of Mexico. At EPA, we're going to see action probably both with respect to a minimum clean air and clean water areas. Methane regulations being a high point, a target point in clean air, waters of the United States, other related issues in the Clean Water Act. Over at the Department of Transportation and the Pipeline and Hazardous Safety Materials Administration, we're looking at changing the scope of regulation there with respect to the coverage of gathering lines that hadn't been treated under the federal regime before. And that may even include farm taps, depending on how it's structured. The Council of Environmental Quality, which is not an area that gets much attention, is the place where a lot of agency or administration-wide policies are managed. One of those will be the social cost of carbon, social cost of methane, used in making decisions on federal decisions with respect to the benefits that various regulatory actions can take by elevating the benefit of reducing carbon to offset the costs of the regulatory pieces. We're seeing potential for a full revision of the Trump administration's changes to the National Environmental Policy Act. And then we can turn to an area which hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the past, that's FERC. Gas pipeline permitting has been a target for the last several years. One of the big issues there has been how FERC will consider the impact of a gas pipeline project in the context of things like the social cost of carbon and how it's used in determining whether that pipeline segment or that entire pipeline is going to be permitted. And in a new arena, we're going to see the potential for going after the financing of the industry, whether it's through the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Treasury Department itself, or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation. All of those are now looking at ways to insinuate themselves somehow into the industry and into decisions that are made by the industry with respect to getting money for its use. I seem to have just, sorry about that. I accidentally hit a button and disconnected myself. Then we turn to Congress, and in the congressional arena, we obviously are hamstrung by the tight margins, both in the House but certainly in the Senate, where it's a tie vote requires the actions to be taken by the Vice President when those votes turn out to be 50-50. So the use of legislative options is somewhat limited, but one of the ways it can work is through the budget reconciliation process. That avoids the ability to filibuster, but it has to be limited to certain fiscal issues, not broad policy changes. Unfortunately, one of those fiscal issues is tax policy, and reconciliation may well be the pathway to deal with tax reform as it was under the 2017 Act that was done by the Republican Senate, House, and President Trump. It's also possible that, as you probably are reading in the papers, there's a considerable onslaught over how to deal with the filibuster in the Senate, whether it'll continue as it exists or modified or it's eliminated. Those actions can significantly change the way votes can be taken, but they can also significantly disrupt the way the Senate works. It's a body that lives by consent and compromise. If you suddenly take away consent, you can barely even read the prayer in the morning, and that can be a big change in the way the Senate works. But we're starting to see legislation there getting introduced. Lots of discussion over a new Clean Future Act, which includes several provisions directly targeting oil and natural gas, having little to do in most cases with climate, but just basically bills that have been introduced in the past with the support of anti-drilling organizations. We'll see where that one goes. We talk about that a little more. At the same time, we're seeing all these discussions over an infrastructure bill, what that may look like, what kind of provisions it might have in arenas like environmental justice, whether that's going to be the carrier for a tax reform package. And clearly, when we get into taxes, you can assume that all the industry tax provisions are on the table. You can also assume that we may be relooking at business tax rates, personal tax rates, deductions. Possibility of a carbon tax is always hanging out there. There's new ideas that are surfacing to do some sort of emissions fees, potentially on methane. So all those are things that could be played. And then we get into much more devious things like perhaps reestablishing a ban on food exports, restricting the use or the export of liquefied natural gas. So these are all things that could be in play. But legislatively, it's a much harsher pathway because of the tight margins. So with that, I think it might be better to kind of talk about some of the more specifics to a Q&A.
That was plenty of good news, Lee, tongue in cheek there. And before I throw it to Jim, just thinking through some of these, particularly the cost of carbon, and so often it's assigned to oil or to natural gas. But just recently, in the last month, we've seen here with the storms in Texas that when those quote unquote green technologies fail, that you have to rely on more reliable sources of energy. And I'm just wondering if they ever contemplate in Congress the alternative. If we don't have natural gas, we're either burning coal, or in some countries we're burning wood and biomass. Is it ever contemplated the actual alternative, or is it simply that there's no demand?
That's been one of the ongoing difficulties with the whole concept of the social cost of carbon. Almost all of its focus has been on the benefits of reducing carbon. And one of the great frustrations, particularly if you're dealing on a global basis, is understanding the implications of changing energy supply in a positive sense with natural gas, or retaining it in a negative sense with respect to forcing these poor nations to continue to utilize really terrible choices, whether they're deforesting their lands,
right,
burning stuff in their houses. I should give an unmitigated pitch here for IPAA in part, but we had a webinar last week with Scott Tinker. I'm sure many of the people on this call are well aware of, and that's available through our website. He did an excellent job of walking through a lot of the points that you just touched on in terms of what it means around the world to have good sources of clean burning fuels, and how that needs to become a part of the policy discussion. But making it a part of the policy discussion with the kinds of people who are managing this issue now is going to be a big challenge. It's one of those issues where, as I kind of alluded to, you get analyses out of that are being used now that would be challenged by any good energy economist. And yet, if you challenge it, you're immediately viewed as a climate denier, and you're discounted as not being able to justify any of the statements you made. Very frustrating.
Yep. Well, thank you very much for that intro and that follow up on something that's frustrated me as I'm watching some of these analysis from DC. I'd now like to bring in Jim Stanley, the Alliance's Senior Policy Advisor, to the conversation. So, Jim, you've got some more specific questions, so take it away.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Lee, it's good to see you again, if only virtually. Yeah, good. We started off with WOTUS and methane, but I think in terms of the impact of where we're going from a regulatory standpoint and legislatively to a large extent also, is that Biden, about his first couple of weeks of being inaugurated, has instructed all the agency heads to take a look at every single thing that the Trump administration did from a regulatory standpoint, specifically on environmental issues. We've got WOTUS and methane there, and we've worked on both of those issues for a long, long time. My understanding is that right now they have, the administration has told the judges, the district court judges, to put a hold on those cases. Is that correct?
That's basically accurate. If you want to kind of use the experience the Trump administration had dealing with the Obama administration as somewhat of a map, you remember what happened there is Trump came in, wanted to do the same thing, wanted to stop all the Obama rules, went to the courts. The courts would not let him do that, but they did put the cases in abeyance in many respects that we had, for example, challenging those rules. Until the Trump administration had an opportunity to try to deal with them. And what that then triggered was the full-scale regulatory process again. I think that's going to be a lot of what we're going to see with the Biden administration. They have asked that the cases that were challenging the Trump rules, many cases rules we were now supporting, be put into abeyance, and the courts have generally given them that flexibility. So I don't think we're going to see many of those, if any of those cases, move forward anytime in the next several years. What we will more likely see is the Biden administration will start the same process the Trump administration had to do, which is to revisit the regulations, look at making the changes it wants to make, even if some of those are things like on the rule changing the regulatory target from initially from methane to VOC under Trump back to methane under Biden. That still has to go through the rulemaking process, the Administrative Procedure Act. It still has to have a proposal. It has to have supporting documents for that proposal. It has to go through comment. Then eventually those comments have to be considered, and then they come back with a final rule. Now, I think one of the challenges that the Trump administration had to deal with was it had a lot of stuff on its plate. It was slow in getting its people in position to take action. And so the path for that eventually meant that for several of those rules, and the methane regulations notable in that regard, didn't get done until 2020, till August of 2020. Right. I would think the Biden administration have much greater support within the bowels of the Environmental Protection Agency to get these things done more quickly. But there's still a process that you have to go through, and that process takes time. And so we're going to see this unfolding, I think, over the next several years.
You know, speaking of the legislative side of things, a couple of days ago, or last week, I guess it was, this Clean Futures Act was introduced. Yes. And that rolled together several regulatory issues, including methane and WOTUS, but also RCRA and flaring and some other things, trying to get everything in one basket. How do you see that, the legislative tracking next to the rule changes?
Well, there's like 6 provisions that we've identified so far that are specifically related to oil and natural gas in that Clean Futures bill. 2 of them are air related. One of them sets methane targets for reduction of 65% by 2025 and 90% by 2030 based on 2012 levels, which was about the time that the first Quado rule came in. So a lot of those steps have already been taken. But then it requires new regulations to be put in place using the new source performance standard process, requiring them on both new and existing sources, changing the time frame for that to happen. So if that were to pass, it would truncate some of the speed with which the Biden administration is moving and set these mandatory targets not necessarily requirements, but targets in place, those would have an effect. They could shorten the existing source piece. I'm not sure it really, they're not mandating in this version of it, which they've done in the past, that the Obama rules go back into place as a part of that process. They could choose to do that. I think the Trump administration would prefer to have its own ability to manage that process, but that could happen. The second methane rule that's there is one that's designed to try to set standards to reduce routine flaring. Now, the key to that is what's routine flaring. As I'm sure all of you are dealing with flaring issues. What constitutes routine flaring? That's not really a place where the Clean Air Act gives the Biden administration a lot of room to move right now. That's not really a jurisdictional area, I don't think. The other four deal with laws that are unrelated to clean air. One of them sets a new UIC standard for enhanced oil recovery using carbon dioxide in ways that I've yet to figure out exactly what their purpose there is, and kind of find that out. If people will get a chance to look at that, we're interested in trying to understand what the implications would be. Another one puts fracturing under the Safe Drinking Water Act, requires monitoring wells around fractured wells. Another one goes into RCRA. This has been a hot point since the Natural Resources Defense Council proposed this back in 2007, I think it was, to essentially repeal the Subtitle C suspension, making drilling fluids, produced water subjected to hazardous waste treatment under RCRA if they test hazardous. Right. But at the same time, requiring mandatory guidelines under Subtitle D. You may recall during the Trump administration, we had a big effort to try to force Subtitle D regulation structure, and the states stepped in, IOGCC, Groundwater Protection Council, to make commitments to EPA that they would be reviewing their state regulations. Subtitle D is much more flexible, but this would require a mandatory federal structure there. And the final one, it goes back to some clean air issues from 1990. One of them is dealing with removing an aggregation prohibition with respect to hazardous air pollutants. As I think you all know, EPA went through a whole process to redefine how it was going to do aggregation using VOC as the pollutant. I don't know what that really purpose of that is, except it's a hot button for environmentalists. The other part of it is to list hydrogen sulfide as a hazardous air pollutant under the Clean Air Act, but EPA looked at that in 1995 when Carol Browner was the head of EPA and said it was inappropriate. Right. So we've got those things hanging out there. The Clean Future Act, there's a lot of speculation about what's really going to happen with it. And they're doing hearings now. Interestingly, none of these provisions really described as part of the bill in their summaries. Right. A lot of speculation is what they're trying to do is set up a mechanism to be able to take pieces of it and move it into the infrastructure bill. Whether this is a part of that or not, right, way too early to tell. Most of those bills, by the way, were reintroduced as standalone bills yesterday by a group of Democrats. So it's a big challenge. At this point in time, there's no corresponding provisions being identified in the Senate. So if they try to move it in the House, you still have to have a Senate issue to deal with. It's a policy changes, which makes it hard to do under reconciliation. So there's a lot of difficult pathways on that one.
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to beat the methane issue to death, but yesterday.
Why not? I like to beat it to death. It's what I spend all my time on.
Gina McCarthy met with a group of majors and large independents. And you know that when we were fighting for the exemption for strip of wells and the off-ramp for strip of wells on the recent rule, that we had some companies, particularly the majors and large independents, that did not agree with that exemption. And evidently, at least based on what I know today, part of that meeting with Gina McCarthy yesterday was to lay down the fact that they want some different methane regulations, essentially stricter. I don't think we've all been around for a while. I don't think we've seen too many times where we've had the majors and the independents have different views on a very important issue and have anything good come out of it. How do you see us approaching this with the majors going down the road?
Well, this is an area where we've seen divisions within the independent producer community as well over their support for methane regulation. And the reality is that in terms of large facilities, whether you had a VOC rule or a methane rule, the requirements are going to be the same.
Right.
The issue has always been that the regulation that EPA wrote for primarily the fugitive emissions component, that's really where most of the attention lies, it was written with the intent not to include low production wells, but then politically they chose to add them at the very end of that process, but they never went back and looked at whether the technology that they had assumed was appropriate for those large wells was appropriate for the small wells.
Right.
And that's where we've been having our discussions for the past, well, throughout the Trump administration, and really before that with in the waning days of the Obama administration, partly with respect to new sources where it's much less of a likelihood of occurring since most people aren't rushing out to try to drill low production wells, but much more so with respect to what would happen to existing facilities. We were successful with the Trump administration in finally convincing them that there were differences with respect to the technology being applied for fugitive emissions monitoring for large wells when you went to small wells, and they did create the off-ramp that was in the rule. We've started trying to reach out to the Biden administration to push them to recognize that they never really had the data that was necessary to look at these rules with regard to low production wells. And in fact, the work that's been done by the Department of Energy to try to identify the emissions profile is a really important factor to take into account in making a judgment about whether to keep that off-ramp that was included in the final revisions from the Trump administration as a part of whatever revisions they choose to go back and make. So we're just at the beginning stages of having that discussion. I would say that in general, the large independents, the large integrated companies are not particularly engaged with the low production well issue. It's been a small producer issue. It's not that they are against having something there for it, but from their internal perspective, and as this is where we go back to these other pressures that are being put on larger companies by things like the environment, social, and governance requirements that they're facing, they've made a decision that on their facilities, they've already put the technology in.
Right.
And they've gone back voluntarily to many of their existing facilities, I'm sure you're all aware of this, and put in the kind of retrofitted equipment. On the other hand, they've also been very frustrated with the technology that they have to use, the FLIR camera technology, to identify their emissions because it is so burdensome, so costly, so inaccurate, and there's much better technologies coming out that they wanted to see changes in that regard. So we're going to have a lot of nuanced issues in that discussion going forward.
Yeah, I expect so. Thanks very much. I'm going to change the subject on here real quick for a minute before I turn it over to Carr. What was called the federal leasing ban that is now being called, putting it on hold. But where do you see that whole thing going? That and the associated increase in royalties.
I think both of those things are going to continue to get pressure under this administration. They've been too loud, too strong during the campaign to walk away from that. Now, what's happening to them? Look at New Mexico. Look at the indigenous tribes that they're out to try to help in their rhetoric. And what they're finding is those communities are getting hurt if you can't produce federal land, oil, and gas.
Right.
And New Mexico has made it very clear, we're going to get hurt if you go forward on this. Now, that puts them in an awkward box. They've got to figure out some way to try to, make some adjustments to deal with those very real consequences. I think they continue to get enormous pressure from their environmental side of their coin to just slam it down, try to stop it altogether, raise the royalty. They have these interesting hearings where half the Democrats are complaining because we need to stop this federal land development of oil and gas, all development of oil and gas because of its climate implications, and the other half are complaining they're not getting enough money from the royalties.
Right.
They want to raise the royalty rate. So we're going to see that as a continuing issue, and where it winds up is going to be a very, I think, hard to judge event because of the consequences to some of the key states like New Mexico, maybe Colorado as well.
And, any idea at all about how, I mean, they've kind of changed their tune a little bit in terms of taking a look at it, not necessarily this banning it forever. How, is there any time frame that you know about that we could look at?
Well, they talked about a 60-day hold. I think it's going to run beyond 60 days. It probably already has run beyond 60 days. So, they're doing this meeting Thursday, I think, where they're going to try to get a bunch of public input. That's sort of a contrived meeting as well. They're only getting certain people are allowed to talk, and they're not going to necessarily give them too much time if they start getting off the reservation. There's litigation on the issue that's pushing back on it as well. I think it's going to be, hot for the rest of the year.
Okay.
I don't know how fast or what kind of mechanisms they'll use. You could construct some sort of a mechanism that links further development to tougher regulation in the state and things like that. I wouldn't be surprised if one of those ideas doesn't start surfacing as a way for them to back away. I don't know what they do with the indigenous tribe, the indigenous tribes in that.
That's a whole separate issue. Yeah. Well, Lee, as always, thanks for your insight. I'm going to flip this over to Carr now. He's got some hard questions on the legislative side.
He always does.
Oh yeah, these are a piece of cake for you. You and I chatted within the last couple of weeks. I think the day after this law API carbon tax dust up. Apparently a draft document making its way around the American Petroleum Institute was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. And that next morning, we heard from a goodly number of our independent operators who were quite exercised by this, justifiably, I think. The purpose of a carbon tax, or the means for achieving the purpose of a carbon tax, is really focused on one thing, and that is making energy considerably more expensive to consumers. So given that fact, and members of Congress who represent those consumers that would have to vote for this, what's the likelihood of a progression and passage of a carbon tax or some other carbon pricing mechanism that does indeed make end-use energy, gasoline, et cetera, more expensive to U.S. consumers?
That's a key question. It really is. There's already been a lot of talk about carbon taxes. Carbon pricing, cap and trade, one thing or another. But when it starts really getting pushed, the key question becomes, well, is the public willing to accept a substantial increase in carbon price? So for example, a lot of times you see bills have been introduced that have used roughly a $50 a ton type of number for the carbon tax that they want to implement. That works out to roughly 50 cents a gallon of gasoline. Okay. So how many congressmen do you see running around saying, here's what I want to do. I want to raise your gasoline price by 50 cents a gallon for global climate. Because when you see various surveys that are out there about that, people are about to say, well, maybe I'd spend a dime, but maybe a dime a year, but not necessarily 50 cents for every gallon every time I go to the pump. So you've seen bills that first raise the tax and then give it all back to at least certain segments of the communities. None of those have really gelled very much. Simultaneously, the environmental community, which at one point in time was very interested in the idea of carbon tax, has sort of drifted away from it. They see it as much more complicated to implement. They see some of these consumer reactions, which could hurt their larger agenda on responding to climate. And they want to keep that agenda as hidden in terms of who bears the cost or when, who should be blamed for the cost as they can. So a transparent tax change is one that they're not all that enthusiastic about. If you think about it, we have like 4 carbon taxes that are in place today. We have a gasoline tax, we have a diesel fuel tax, we have a jet fuel tax, and we have a somewhat dormant crude oil tax at the refinery for things like Superfund and oil pollution. if you really want to do something like this, you're going to want to make that most transparent as possible to change people's behavior, which means you ought to be moving for some sort of a gasoline, diesel fuel, home heating oil, jet fuel, natural gas into your house type of tax that's very, very transparent. And that is really hard to convince the Congress to do. Now, is there a pathway that they may get pushed into it? One pathway, which probably has nothing to do with their climate agenda, is just pure federal revenue needs, the infrastructure bill. You can only squeeze so much out of going back into the tax code and taking away deductions and raising rates. There's always been a discussion whether you need to have some broad-based VAT-like tax to really pay for the kinds of things that you need to do. At the same time, you've got Europe looking at trying to figure out ways to impose some sort of a border tax on carbon from countries that don't have the same level of commitment as they do, at least on paper. But what they've discovered is when they've done that internally, what they did was move the manufacturing to different countries, and they bought them. So there's just a lot between where people talk today and whether something's ever going to happen on it that we'll have to see as the details get more fleshed out. I think some of the reports yesterday were saying that the people that met with Gina McCarthy were embracing the idea of some kind of carbon pricing, but you really have to see what that means before you look at it, and you really have to see whether there's any political support for it among the people that have to vote to impose that tax before you really can make a judgment about what's going to happen, I think.
Well, I couldn't agree more. We also wrote a little bit about just kind of the bad economics of a U.S. domestic carbon tax.
Absolutely. But as I've said, these economic studies that we're seeing are really pretty thin. I think you probably looked at a lot of them, Barb.
I do.
You'd never write one like that.
Well, I wrote a little bit last week in a couple of our publications, and I'd like to write a book about that. My goodness. It just looks to me like the walls between us and them, quote unquote, between Republicans and Democrats, between the minority and the majority, between oil and gas companies and anti-fossil fuel companies, between sensible policy and just extreme climate groups and the policies that they put forth, and between sanity and insanity, are just crumbling. We lost the White House, hoped we might keep the Senate. That fell with Georgia. The remaining hope for the minority, or all of these things on that side, appear to be maybe Joe Manchin, a moderate senator from a fossil fuel producing state, maybe a few moderate House Democrats in oil and gas producing states, reconciliation, which they seem intent on stretching beyond where it's gone before to suit their purposes, and the filibuster, which is under discussion now. How well can oil and gas operators, independent oil and gas operators who don't want anything to do with any of this, expect to be served by these remaining hopes in terms of stopping bad legislation?
Well, we're in an unknown world. So anything I suggest is my speculation. It is true with the 50-50 Senate that it is you can identify a couple of senators at the outset. Manchin has kind of stepped up and said, look, I'm not going to do crazy things. I'm not going to support the Indian filibuster. I'm not going to support bad policies. I want to work with Republicans. But when he's been pushed into it, he's been largely forced to vote with the Democrats. Senator Sinema from Arizona, I think, has made similar kinds of statements. But so far, they haven't been pushed to the edge. One of the big challenges in these arenas, and it's a little bit like what you see, let's say, take the Clean Future Act. Clean Future Act has multiple sections dealing with all sorts of things, a few of which are oil and natural gas. And so when you're looking at those bills and you're a member, you can't fight every single thing that's out there. And so you're gonna have to decide which things are the ones that are most important and which ones you can stand up to. And that's always been a challenge. Good examples on tax policy. you get a big tax bill moving and they throw in some bad provision, the train's going out of the station with this big bill that has a lot of good stuff in it, but there's some bad stuff on the side. And so that's where we're going to have to work really hard, is trying to get some of the bad things stopped before they get to be part of the framework, if you will. We'd like to see tax policy stopped in the finance committee, most likely, where you've got an even split, and you do have some oil state Democratic members on there that we're hoping to be able to convince that they don't really want to take a bad vote on some of these issues, and so they should try and stop them before they get to that stage. And I think that you will see efforts trying to frame these issues with less visibility than the first round of the COVID appropriations package. But it ultimately will depend upon how willing the leadership of the Democratic Party is to deal with its waning moderate elements and not placate its expanding extreme elements to put bills by. Because they have the flip side of it is, while you can't lose Joe Manchin, you can't lose Bernie Sanders either. And while you can't lose Lizzie Fletcher, let's say, in Texas, you can't lose AOC either. And that's where the leadership is going to be faced with some really difficult dilemmas to try to come up with bills that they can move to the point of getting them passed. And Republicans will have to decide whether they're willing to play at some level. There's a group of 20, I think, that's been created in the Senate of 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans to try to see whether there's ways that they can work together to frame some of these bills up, meaning that if you got all 20 of them, you'd have 60 votes, assuming you didn't lose some of the liberal Democrats on the path out there. So these are issues that are always difficult when you have such tight margins in the Congress.
Well, one final question for me, and then we may have an audience question or two. Last year, Texas' share of, even though production was going down in Texas and nationally, our share of U.S. national production actually went up to, in some months, about 43, 44%. And it's been well above 40% for at least a couple of years now, growing over the last 10 years. So Texas, with very little in the way of federal production, is about to be ground and supply constraints from pipeline permits being yanked and so on, Keystone XL, maybe Dakota. Texas kind of becomes ground zero potentially for domestic energy production now. It's hard to imagine with 40+% of U.S. oil and gas production, U.S. crude oil production, 25+% of natural gas production, are going to be trying to find a way to cut into us. What is the likely mechanism for attacking a state like Texas where they can't get at us easily with the stroke of a pen and an executive order?
Well, we're pondering that same question, as you might expect. So I would say that there's two things, there's a couple of areas that they could move into. And it's not EPA regulation, and it's not FERC, because you can get your product to the Gulf of Mexico, right, without having to go through FERC in many respects, your gas problem. But you can go after money. You can start trying to restrict access to capital by putting mandates on banks, mandates on the kinds of funding opportunities that are available. That's one way to go. That's where we get worried to think about things like reinstating the crude oil export ban, restricting the use of the export capability for LNG. Those are all things that could get to the American producer. This is one of the problems with their strategy of trying to eliminate supply, is they can try to stop supply, but unless they change demand, the world isn't going to change. The America is not going to change. There's a great push to have electric vehicles. I think we sell something like 17 million gasoline-powered vehicles a year, and then we sell about couple 100,000 electric vehicles right now. Well, you can grow that couple 100,000 real fast, but you got 100 and some million gas-powered vehicles on the road that just not going to go away. And poor people sure aren't going to get rid of them, to get an expensive electric vehicle.
Right.
So you've got to have a demand change that makes sense, and it's got to have a timeline to it that makes sense. If you cut off supply, all you're doing is bringing in foreign oil again. Or restricting all energy. Another thing, you want to get more electric vehicles, you got to generate more electricity, and you got to lose 25% of it getting it to the consumer because of line loss. So all of these real world energy factors are not going into the debate yet. But to go back to your underlying question, I would say the areas that have been behind the screen for a long time are things like trying to cut away capital, and whether it's private capital or public capital, making it just harder and harder. And some of that becomes internal. These companies that give you, the capital companies, are being pressed by the environmental left as hard as the oil industry is to try to stop lending money. I know there's a bill floating in Texas about restricting.
Quite a popular bill, actually.
Huh?
Quite a popular bill, it seems.
Quite a popular bill, yeah. To see, the state money can't be invested with banks that don't support fossil energy, and I think that's the counterpoint to where a lot of the other bills are going, and where some of the federal regulatory processes may go. And then the eliminating exports would really cripple the industry in large measure.
Right.
That would be another place.
Great.
So we're paying attention to all of that.
Well, look forward to continuing to work with you on these things. Really enjoyed the visit this morning, although
Sure.
You're a happy little ray of sunshine. I have to tell you that much.
That's what I do, Carr. I try to become a happy ray of sunshine.
That's what you are. Certainly are to me and to us. So thanks again. I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Perfect, Carr. Thank you. And I did want to follow up, Lee, on kind of that messing with Texas theme. We've seen House Energy and Commerce have several hearings over the past several weeks, have another one scheduled tomorrow on the Texas storm. And wondered, from your perception, what is the current kind of view regarding the role of natural gas during the recent polar vortex that impacted Texas? It's one where I think that there needs to be the factual issues need to really get vetted more fully, and I'm not sure how quickly all of that can take place. The analyses I've seen, including one by Scott Tinker last week, suggest to me that gas really played a huge role in preventing the worst of the problems from occurring much earlier, and it was only when it got to the point where the weather wasn't changing fast enough and you started seeing limitations on gas getting into the marketplace, partly from what I understand, based on choices that were made by the regulators as to what the priority users would be, that gas started becoming, it couldn't keep up. Not that it hadn't done an enormous amount of activity to do that. And I think getting those facts out in the midst of what will clearly be an enormous effort on the part of wind and solar to avoid any blame, it will be the real task that's in front of you. Absolutely, and that's an ongoing task here at the Texas Capitol as well. Had a question come in about in-person events. Wondered if IPAA is planning on any in-person events coming up soon, and then maybe if y'all have any plans for some fly-ins to DC later this year.
We don't have anything on the charts at this point in time, and candidly, I don't know what the world's going to look like going forward in terms of those kind of events. I mean, after not only the COVID dynamic, but the January 6th dynamic. If I'm Congress, I'm not sure I want to let these large groups, and our group is maybe 75 people when we go in there. But when we're in there, frequently we're with groups that have 150, 200 people that they're trying to jam into the halls of Congress for call-ups. And I really don't know that those kinds of events are going to have the kind of future existence that they've had in the past, just because of the security concerns. Now that may work out over time, but I don't think it's going to work out quickly. There's a part of me that wonders how much even people who are in Washington, who are lobbyists who work the Hill all the time, will be able to get into Congress. I remember when I first left the Hill and went to work as a lobbyist, at that point in time I had to go get an ID. I didn't know that the ID existed, but I got to get the ID. Nobody ever asked me for it. So it expired after a couple of years. I probably looked a lot better on it. I should probably get it out again. But I wouldn't be surprised if they do some sort of a registration process for you to get into the Hill to visit your own congressman. And that who knows how fast that's going to evolve.
Exactly right. Wondered how can the Alliance help you help IPAA?
Well, one of the main things, I think we sent out to you some of these provisions that are in these bills. Talking to your members, we're reaching out to our members trying to get what does this mean to you? Because many of these bills now get introduced as an important measure to hone down on all the damage the oil and gas industry is doing. But they don't explain what the damage is. They just assert that there's damage, it's a loophole, shouldn't be there. But we're going to have to come back with factual responses to it. And I'll give you a small example. The RCRA issue, the RCRA Subtitle C issue. When I was working for Lloyd Benson, that's when we passed that provision. And at the time, the issue was that most drilling fluids were being managed in drilling kits. Most drilling fluids were oil-based. The RCRA rules were out there. One of the problems was that you had to do a test, and you can test day after day, it'd be non-hazardous, but you're drilling through cores of earth and you never know what's going to go in the drilling mud. So all of a sudden, it could be hazardous. And now all of your mud is hazardous and it has to go get treated under RCRA Subtitle C, which is never designed for this kind of an operation. So the question is, how's the world changed? Does the mud act the same way? The mud's susceptible to the same problem of becoming hazardous at a moment's notice. And then what happens if it does? What's the capacity to manage it in RCRA Subtitle C, which is, to me, probably non-existent because you have to burn most of it. I don't think you need to burn a lot of dirt, but that's what the law says, what you have to do. So it's those kind of things. And what's the pragmatic implication on some of these things that are out there? And the same is true with the regulatory arena. We're going to see regulatory proposals. You guys have been active with us on the methane issue, for example, for years. And that's been very helpful because it gets the on the ground kind of experience with what's happening in play.
Well, that's perfect, Lee, and thank you again for the time today and your insight. Do you have any closing thoughts for our members?
Well, just keep hanging in there. It's not going to be it's going to be a wild ride. Let's put it that way. But maybe you all live and exist in exciting times, but we're going to be living in some exciting times.
It's well said, and thank you again, Lee, for the time today. We greatly appreciate our partnership with IPAA and working with you, and thank you for the plug on the Scott Tinker webinar. We'll go find that and push that out to our members. That's a great resource.
He really did he does a nice job. As you know, Scott Tinker does a great job on presenting big picture energy issues. He does a nice job. Nice slides, very fascinating.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, Lee. We'll let you go.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much to our board members for joining us today. Psy Wagner, Houston Sullivan, Alan Frizzell, Amy Patterson, Charlotte McBride, Jim Chimuto, and John Duran. Thank you very much. I also saw Judy Stark from the Panhandle Producers. Judy, thank you for joining us. Many thanks again to our President's Forum sponsors, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Marathon Oil. If you are interested in sponsoring future events, we want to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us. Please be sure to fill out the exit survey so we can make these events even better. Appreciate y'all being with us. Thank you.